In Australia, fewer people are going to be able to buy a home in their lifetime if nothing changes. Now, that may sound like an exaggeration, but even though Australia is known for its great healthcare and education, very low crime rates, and high income per person, making it one of the richest countries in the world, the cost of living or owning a home is really high. It has become so bad that more and more Australians are leaving or thinking about moving to other countries. Australian newspapers are packed with stories from people who are really struggling due to the devastating housing crisis.
The housing and rental crisis is out of control.
Supply of houses for sale are considerably down on the past 3 or 4 years.
Today, Australia's housing market stands as one of the most expensive globally, with an average value of over 1.4 million Australian dollars in Sydney. If you think house prices are only high in Sydney, you're mistaken. Other cities like Canberra and Melbourne are somewhat cheaper at 967,860 and 948,040 Australian dollars, respectively. But prices still remain incredibly high. When we look at housing prices in other developed countries, such as Canada, the overall cost of living, including housing, is 13.2% lower than in Australia. And while Australia has a high standard of living, it also grapples with a high household debt to income ratio of 211%, overshadowing figures from the US of 101%, the UK's 148%, and Japan's 115%. This indicates that despite economic prosperity and quality of life, housing costs pose a significant burden for households. So, why are houses so ridiculously expensive in Australia? Australia's population has grown by more than 25% between the 2001 and 2016 census years. In Australia, the housing market is strongly influenced by population growth and limited land availability, especially in major cities like Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne. This increased demand, combined with an inadequate supply response, drives up average house prices. Today's housing affordability crisis was planted years ago, but the situation really started to escalate around the year 2000. This was largely due to the Howard government's decision in 1999 to offer discounts on capital gains taxes, which acted like a spark, igniting a surge in housing prices. Efforts to increase regional housing supply have faced various obstacles, such as zoning restrictions, infrastructure limitations, and local opposition to development. These challenges make it difficult to address poor housing affordability nationwide. Another factor contributing to high house prices in Australia is the rising costs of land and infrastructure. Additionally, there are higher monthly repayments. When interest rates rise, so do monthly mortgage repayments. This can make it harder for people to buy a home, and as interest rates rise, the amount of money people can borrow from a bank decreases. This means that if nothing changes, more than 2 million Australian households on low incomes and private rentals will be in housing stress by 2051. If drastic changes aren't implemented by the government, your life chances will depend entirely on the family you're born into. You can see the cracks in the policy for a longer period of time. The home ownership rate has been declining since the 1980s in a country that prided itself on being a society of equal opportunity. Safe and affordable housing is fundamental to the well-being of Australians, with home ownership being a key goal. It provides stability, social and economic benefits, and contributes to long-term prosperity and community spirit. But as mentioned, the dream of home ownership is changing in Australia, with consequences for people of all ages and backgrounds. While the desire to own a home remains, achieving it is becoming more difficult. As of 2019 to 2020, about 66% of Australian households owned their home, either outright or with a mortgage, similar to 2017 to 2018, but a slight decrease from 68% in 2015 to 2016. The dream of owning a home in the future is becoming increasingly difficult, as when we look at the average salaries across different age groups and the rapidly rising house prices, it paints a bleak picture. If you're 21 years or older, the average weekly salary is $1,679.70. This amount is not proportional to the average house prices in cities like Sydney, where houses typically cost around $1.4 million. As people get older, their earning potential increases. The age group between 35 and 54 years earns an average of about $2,200 per week for a full-time worker, but this income growth still struggles to keep pace with the escalating housing market. Due to the significant gap between affordable housing and salaries, the result is that many young adults are renting or even returning to parental homes out of economic necessity. Globally, rising rents and a lack of affordable housing is a growing trend, but nowhere is it as severe as in Australia. It's so bad that you would need to save for an average of 12.6 years for a 20% down payment on an average house in Sydney. And this isn't unique to Sydney. Essentially, all major Australian cities exhibit a similar trend. Now, you might be wondering, if buying a house is nearly impossible, why not just rent? Well, perhaps a lesser evil, but still highly expensive. The nation has been facing a rental crisis for some time now, with many landlords passing on their rising mortgage repayments to tenants. The rental crisis is getting worse, and it's affecting not only capital cities, but also regional areas. This surge in housing demand in some regional areas, triggered by population shifts related to COVID-19, has led to a sharp increase in rental prices nationwide, pushing them to levels that are now out of reach for many. The least affordable place of all regions and capital cities to rent is regional Queensland, with rentals coming in at an average of $553 a week. Spread out across a year, this equates to 30% of the average Australian income, placing these Australians within the category of rental stress. Although rental costs in regional areas have risen more slowly than in capital cities, the impact on rental prices is nevertheless noticeable. Due to years of housing undersupply combined with rising interest rates, increasing living costs, and a sharp rise in the number of people entering the country, the forecast is that the rental issue will persist for years to come. The good news is that the housing market problems don't have to be so severe, and Australia can turn this around. But the bad news is that this is unlikely to happen. Australia is such a vast area that naturally should have an abundance of cheap land to build affordable homes. However, the problem is that in Australia, unlike in most places, an overwhelming majority of people are concentrated in the major cities along the southeast coast because these areas offer the most livable conditions. The majority of Australia's terrain is arid and doesn't support large populations, leading to a concentration of residents in regions with better access to resources. As urbanization in Australia continues to increase, the supply of available land becomes more and more limited and will only worsen. And despite the urgent demand, the construction of new homes has not kept pace with it. With only 400 dwellings for every 1,000 people, Australia's housing market has one of the lowest housing supply rates among developed countries, but remains one of the most expensive. The housing crisis in Australia is pushing people to the edge, making homes too expensive and hard to find. While some count their losses and leave the country, more than 1,600 people each month are becoming homeless, with a 7.5% increase compared to 4 months ago. The demand for homeless services is growing rapidly. A big part of the problem is the soaring rent, outstripping people's earnings and worsening rental affordability. For example, a person's rent jumping from $420 to $550 a week has forced individuals to find alternative living situations, such as moving into a bus or a high school gym. This situation has led over 80 housing organizations to demand a national reform of the rental market, aiming to establish minimum rent standards and protect Australians from sudden rent increases and substandard living conditions. They're also advocating for at least 10% of all dwellings to be social housing to provide more security and affordability. This housing squeeze is not just a personal crisis for many, it's a looming disaster for Australia's economy. High housing costs and the threat of homelessness has led to decreased consumer spending and increased social services costs, straining public resources. Without significant policy changes, the situation could deter potential immigrants. The country needs immigration for maximum economic benefit, but such high immigration naturally stimulates demand for more housing. In other words, if you want many people to come in, you need to be able to build enough homes for them. Australia fails in this regard miserably, and unfortunately for Australians, it's unlikely to improve. The only way out of this crisis is to balance supply and demand, which would mean drastically limiting immigration or significantly increasing the number of houses Australia builds. Australia needs the workforce to keep its key industries running. Currently, with 26% of Australians concerned about becoming homeless, the government's inaction on housing reform and rent control is critically urgent. The proposed National Housing and Homelessness Plan, aiming for a 10-year strategy, could be said to be a step in the right direction, but needs swift and decisive action to combat growing challenges. The desire for the traditional symbol of success isn't fading, but with less space and more people, prices will rise, and Australia will further plunge into crisis. It's important for everyone living in Australia to understand what the rapidly rising housing costs mean in the short and long term. This will help plan and act accordingly to minimize economic stress.